Everyone. So this week we're going to be continuing our discussion of the philosophy of time. We're going to be picking up on some of the themes from last week's lecture, except that we're going to be looking at more closely some of the implications of special relativity for the theories of time that we introduced last week. So bringing together some of our more metaphysical discussion last week with some of the more physics-based themes from earlier in term. So I am just going to bring up the handout for this week, which will be following. Okay, so special relativity and the metaphysics of time. So this, just as a reminder, just to sort of recap what we discussed last week. So last week we, sorry, just a second. Oops, don't know what I did there. Seem to have taken a screenshot. Last week we talked about the A theory versus the B theory, but also presentism, eternalism, and the growing universe theory. So the A theory and the B theory were two theories about the nature of time. So according to the A theorist, we sort of invoke McTaggart's notion of A properties. So the A theorist, unlike McTaggart, thinks that these A properties are coherent and exist. So the A properties being pastness, presentness, and futureness, maybe near and distant futureness, near and distant pastness, and so on. And thinks of these as changing properties that events or moments in time have. And so unlike McTaggart, they think that the A series, the A properties are coherent and they exist and that they give us a flow and passage of time. Whereas the B theorist typically denies the intelligibility of the A series, so perhaps for McTaggart's reasons. And yet, also, unlike McTaggart, claims that time does exist, but they tend to think that the B relations are enough for the existence of time. We also looked at the distinction between presentism, eternalism, and the growing universe theories. So these are, on the other hand, different theories of what exists in time. So according to the presentist, only the present exists. According to the eternalist, the past, present, and future all exists. And according to the growing universe theorist, well, the past and present, but not the future exists. So, if you like, A and B theory can be thought of as sort of different theories about the nature of time, whereas presentism, eternalism, and the growing universe theory are different theories about what exists in time. So in a moment, I'll say something about how they relate to one another. The eternalist then conceives of reality as a four-dimensional structure, the so-called block universe theory. The growing universe theorist regards the universe as four-dimensional, but unlike the eternalist, regards this four-dimensional structure as increasing in size as more things come into existence. The primary motivation for the growing universe theory is the intuition that the past is settled, whereas the future is open. So the growing universe theorist will claim to do justice to that intuition in virtue of the fact that her theory says that the past exists, whereas the future doesn't exist. So existence presumably provides a sense in which it's settled, whereas non-existence provides a sense of openness. Now, you might think, well, on the face of it, special theory of relativity favors eternalism, right? So you might think about the nature of Minkowski space-time diagrams. Although they're two-dimensional representations, they represent space-time as a four-dimensional structure. It's just that we suppress two of the temporal dimensions to allow us to to the spatial dimensions to allow us to represent the structure on a piece of paper or on a whiteboard or a computer screen. But they're treating the universe as though it were four-dimensional. Now, so yeah, that might be right. They sort of lend themselves to an eternalist way of thinking about space-time, but it's important not to overinterpret. So it's important not to draw serious metaphysical conclusions on the basis of what's a convenient representation. So you've got to ask whether the representation is just that, whether it's just merely a convenience, or whether there's something deeper there, that maybe we could only represent it like this. But certainly it's worth reflecting upon a bit more carefully upon whether special theory of relativity does indeed favor eternalism, and that's something that we'll be looking at in detail. So how do the two debates relate? So how does the A theory, B theory debate relate to the presentism, growing universal theory, and eternalism debate? Well, presentism and growing universe theory are normally considered versions of the A theory. And that's because the A theory says, well, there's something special about the present. There's something metaphysically privileged about it. It has an objective reality that determines the flow of time and so on. And presentism and growing universe theory both do endow the present with some sort of privileged status. So for the presentist, the present is all that exists, right? So the privileged status of the present, appealed to by the A theorist, is, according to the presentist, existence, right? So it's ontologically privileged. For the growing universe theorist, well, they don't say that only the present exists. They also say that the past exists. So the difference between past and present isn't an ontological difference, although the difference between present and future is an ontological difference. But they still make the present metaphysically special. So the present is the growing edge of the universe, and that gives it a privileged status. The theory is also a dynamic one, so the universe is growing, and this gives us a sense of the passage of time. So again, it's normally considered an A theory. Now, eternalism, you might think, pairs quite well with the B theory, so we might think of the B relations as relating parts of this four-dimensional block universe. And certainly it's true that most, if not all, B theorists are eternalists. However, it is possible to combine eternalism with an A theory. This combination is known as the so-called moving spotlight theory. So eternalism combined with the A theory is the view that past, present, and future all exist, but still there's something privileged metaphysically about the present. It's not that it exists and other stuff doesn't, but maybe there's a special property of presentness. So the metaphor is of a sort of metaphysical moving spotlight that moves across the block universe, the four-dimensional block universe, successively illuminating this sort of special part of existence, of reality, that corresponds to the present. Okay, so last week we considered some kind of standard metaphysical arguments for and against these various theses about time. But this week we're going to consider specifically the bearing that special theory of relativity might have on some of these positions. Now, the sort of bearing of special theory of relativity on presentism might have already occurred to you. And in fact, so there's sort of at least a sort of prima facie problem that special relativity poses for any theory that privileges the present. So if you like, any A theory, whether that be presentism, whether it be the growing universe theory, or whether it be the moving spotlight theory. So all of these theories are A theories. They all say there's something special about the present, something metaphysically privileged about the present. And the problem, or the prima facie problem posed by special relativity, is that it looks like what's present is not a frame invariant notion. So what's present is going to vary across reference frames. In other words, it's going to be velocity dependent. And so one question is, can we really take as metaphysically privileged something that's velocity dependent or frame dependent in that way? So we'll start by looking at the problem as it arises for presentism. We'll look at that in detail, and having seen that, it'll be fairly easy to see how it generalizes to other forms of A theory, like the growing universe theory and the moving spotlight theory. So, as might have already struck you, so the issue is that the present, whatever the present is supposed to be, is normally taken to be a set of points that are simultaneous with one another, a set of, if you like, space-time points that are simultaneous with one another. Why should all of the present be simultaneous with other parts? Should all together be simultaneous, so each part of the present is simultaneous with every other part of the present? Well, normally that's just taken to be part of the concept of the present, that it's all of its parts are simultaneous with one another. So St. Augustine, the medieval philosopher, provided a kind of an argument to elicit this intuition or this conviction. And he said, well, look, if it weren't the case that all the parts of the present were simultaneous with one another, then some would have to lie in the past. Some parts of the present would have to lie in the past of other parts of the present. And St. Augustine just thought that was a contradiction in terms. So, I guess this is sort of pushing this sort of intuition that, sort of what it means to say something is present. It's part of what it means to say that something is present, that it's simultaneous with all the other things that are present. But we've seen that what counts as simultaneous with what is relative to a frame of reference. So we saw with Einstein's thought experiment involving the train, different observers regard different events, different sets of events as simultaneous with one another. So, and correspondingly different events as past and future of one another. So Bob, sitting on the side of the track, observed the two flashes of lightning at the same time, regarded those as simultaneous. Alice, who was sitting in the middle of the train, saw the flash of light from the lightning strike at the front of the train before she observed the strike of lightning coming from the back of the train. And so she regarded the flash from the front as earlier than the flash from the back. So they disagree. Bob regards the events as simultaneous, and when he's observing them, he'll presumably consider them both to be present, whereas Alice regards the flash from the front as earlier than the flash from the back, and so she won't regard both of those as present. She'll regard maybe one as present and one as past, or one as present and one as future, or maybe just one as past and one as future. But this, this looks sort of like a problem for the presentist. So for the presentist, only the present is real, but different observers, in other words, different frames of reference, different velocities, are going to disagree about what's present. And you might just think, well, it really doesn't look that attractive to think that reality is somehow all relative to a frame of reference or relative to a velocity. So what's real relative to one velocity is different from what's real relative to another velocity. You might think that's kind of incoherent. Or even if you don't, you might think it's just an unattractive metaphysical picture, this sort of relativizing of reality. Certainly, it seems to potentially undermine what presentists ordinarily take to be a key motivation for their views. So normally what they'll say is, look, one reason we should be presentists is because each of us has the experience of a privileged present. So there are events around us and things around us that we directly observe. And what we directly observe changes. So this is a motivation for thinking, well, maybe there's something special about this stuff, the stuff that we directly observe. They take that to correspond to the present, and they take the present to be what's real. Now, part of the sort of motivation for doing so is not just that, it seems to each of us individually that there's some privileged set of events, but actually there seems to be at least a decent amount of intersubjective agreement. So typically you and I will more or less agree about what's present. And so I think, many people might be reluctant to read metaphysical conclusions off of an individual's experience if this experience isn't shared with other individuals. So you might think that one individual alone, if they have the experience and that experience isn't shared, then maybe the individual's subject to an illusion or something like that. But the fact that there's intersubjective agreement, broad intersubjective agreement about what is present, maybe lends the presentist greater confidence in inferring a metaphysical conclusion, namely that there's something special about the present, and their interpretation of what's special about the present is that the present exists, whereas the past and the future doesn't. Now, the problem is that special relativity seems to suggest that the intersubjective agreement is kind of an artifact of the fact that most of us share more or less the same reference frame. It's true that there might be slight differences in our reference frame because, we might be moving at slightly different velocities relative to one another. So, driving in cars or walking down the street in different directions. But actually the differences are sort of negligible in the grand scheme of things because these velocities are only very tiny fractions of the speed of light. And so actually there's sort of broad intersubjective agreement about what counts as present. Now, but, this seems very contingent, right? So maybe it certainly seems possible that different members of the population should be traveling at very different velocities. Maybe in the future we'll be whizzing backwards and forwards in spaceships, our own individual spaceships, to distant planets and so on, traveling maybe at significant fractions of the speed of light, and then we would have very different perspectives on what is present. And so what is present for me might be very different from what is present for you. Things that are present for me might be either quite significantly past or future for you. So then there would be no intersubjective agreement, and so we might really hesitate to draw metaphysical conclusions from the fact that, somehow my present seems special to me. And, we should think that already, well, maybe the fact that there's intersubjective agreement is just an accident of the fact that we share similar velocity, so we shouldn't read too much into it. So most presentists seem to acknowledge that there is a problem here. So very few presentists say, okay, fine, reality is frame relative to a velocity. Most presentists seem to find that unattractive. They don't like that relativized picture of reality, whether because they think it's incoherent or they just think it's sort of metaphysically unattractive. They nevertheless reject it. I'm not saying all, but most. And so what most seek to do is to try and modify the presentist picture to bring it maybe more into line with special relativity, to try and bring it so that it says something that's more plausible in light of special relativity. And so what they'll typically do is they'll typically try to look for some relativistically invariant feature, so some frame invariant feature of space-time with which to identify the present, or with which to identify what exists, because they take the skeptical point that it's implausible to regard existence as frame dependent. So we'll look at some possible avenues. So a first possible avenue is the so-called surface model. That's what Hinchliffe and others. So Hinchliffe, his papers on the reading list for this week. So the surface model essentially says, well, okay, look, there is some privileged foliation of space-time. In other words, some privileged assignment of simultaneity relations, or some privileged way of assigning t coordinates. In other words, some privileged Lorentz coordinate system, even though special relativity doesn't tell us what it is. So I guess this, in understanding this, it's sort of important to be clear on the difference between special relativity failing to tell us that something is true versus special relativity telling us that something's false. Now, most presentists, or many presentists, will make the observation that special relativity does not imply that there's no privileged reference frame. Rather, what it does is fail to tell us that there is a privileged reference frame. And that's a difference, right? So it's not positively saying there's no privileged reference frame. It's just failing to privilege a reference frame. And that's an important distinction. So they might say, well, look, special relativity, it fails to privilege a reference frame. That doesn't show that special relativity is wrong. It just shows us that it's incomplete, in the sense that it doesn't give us a complete physical or maybe metaphysical picture of reality. So the idea would be to supplement special relativity with the claim that nevertheless there is a special or privileged reference frame, and its simultaneity or its presentness with respect to that reference frame that constitutes what exists. Now, the challenge, as you might expect, is, it would sort of be not particularly attractive just to leave it at that, just to say, look, yeah, special relativity doesn't tell us there's a privileged reference frame, but I'm telling you there is a privileged reference frame. I'm not going to tell you any more about how we determine it or what it is, but there is one, trust me. That doesn't look like a particularly attractive approach. So a lot of this is going to turn upon what we say about what the privileged reference frame might be. Now, there are various ways of doing this. So maybe one attractive or one reasonably attractive approach would be to identify some physical quantity or some physical magnitude that seems important, and to talk about defining a reference frame with respect to that. So one kind of initial stab at this might be to say, well, what about the center of mass of the universe? So maybe we should take the reference frame of the center of mass of the universe, and center of mass of the universe sort of looks like an important quantity, and we could say that what counts as simultaneous with what is determined by the reference frame of the center of mass of the universe. So yeah, I mean, that's an approach, but I guess the worry is that you might think, well, maybe there are other physical quantities that would look also attractive ways of doing this. So how do we choose one rather than the other? Perhaps another, maybe even more serious worry is that maybe this undercuts some of the initial motivation for presentism. So if you remember, part of the motivation for presentism was supposed to be that, it seems to me as though the present is metaphysically privileged. And so, I have a view on what's present, and that stuff seems special to me. And also, it was noted that, people happen to broadly agree with me about what's present, so maybe we can infer a metaphysical conclusion from this. But actually, presumably, if we're talking about the reference frame of the center of mass of the universe, it's very unlikely that any of us occupies that reference frame. And so, all of the what's present or what's simultaneous with what relative to that reference frame is going to diverge with our simultaneity judgments and our presentness judgments. And so, our initial motivation that what we regarded as present seemed somehow special is not going to motivate the metaphysical conclusion here, because now we're being told that actually the stuff that's special and that exists is not the stuff that we thought. So you might think, well, why bother with such a view? Why not? Given the sort of apparent lack of motivation, why not go for eternalism? Okay, so an alternative approach is so-called here-nowism, or what Hinchliffe calls the point model. So, according to this view, it's not what exists isn't a simultaneity slice of space-time, since there's no absolute simultaneity, and they don't try to privilege one reference frame over another in the way that the surface model does, but rather they say, well, look, there's a point in space-time that counts as the present and counts as what exists. There's no sense in which points in space-time are frame relative, so we seem to avoid this concern about relativizing reality to a reference frame. But this doesn't look like a very attractive view, right? So it shrinks all of reality down to a single space-time point. And space-time points are perhaps infinitely small, or, if space-time is discrete, maybe not infinitely small, but very, very small, smaller than any person, for instance, much smaller. So, I mean, firstly, there's a question of, well, which point in space-time is the special one that exists at the expense of all the others? It might seem that any answer is going to be kind of arbitrary or ad hoc. Maybe you can come up with some point that's physically privileged, the center of mass of the universe or something. But then again, it looks like you sort of undermine most of the motivation for being a presentist in the first place. So the point, well, it could be that it's not part of what any of us regards as present and special. It's worth noting in this context that a point is vastly smaller than a human being. So even if some human being does occupy a region of space-time that includes this point, then it would only actually be a very small piece of that human being that was real. It could well be that no human being occupies that. So what's present and therefore what's real is hardly going to correspond to even any one individual's judgment about what's present and what's real, let alone is it going to do justice to our own subjective judgments about what's present and real. So you might think, again, we've rather undermined the point of presentism, or the motivation for presentism in the first place. A third view is the cone view. So according to this view, what exists is again identified with something that's reference frame invariant, namely what lies on the surface of a past light cone. So remember that the light cone structure of the universe is reference frame invariant because the behavior of light in a vacuum is measured to be the same, observed to be the same in all reference frames. So what's the motivation for this? Well, a sort of initial motivation might be that this helps do justice to the idea that the stuff that I can see is somehow special or privileged. So you might say, well, look, I can see the stuff on my past light cone because it's the stuff that light traveling from which reaches my eyes. And so, it's maybe helps to retain, you might think, one of the initial attractions of presentism. Stuff that I can directly see, it somehow seems special to me. Maybe we can say that, well, that's the stuff that's present and that exists. So yeah, maybe that's all very good. But there are a number of objections to this view, and some of them have probably struck you already. So to start with, we're told by astronomers that the light reaching our retinas from distant stars has traveled for billions of years. So if you observe some event in a distant star, maybe you observe the collapse of a distant star, maybe through a telescope, then and astronomers would ordinarily say that the collapse you're observing occurred billions of years ago, so a long time in the past. But the light cone, or the cone model, is saying that that stuff that you're observing is present and is what exists. So it seems to sort of, maybe this sort of version of presentism is rather out of keeping with ordinary scientific talk. Still, you might say, okay, well, fine, but special relativity tells us that time measurements aren't frame invariant, right? So the t coordinates assigned to different events are going to vary across reference frames. We observed the phenomenon of time dilation, showing that elapsed time isn't a relativistically or a frame invariant notion. So you might think, well, maybe it would be better, rather than talking about zero time as our notion of simultaneity, to talk about zero interval. So relativistic interval is a frame invariant notion. So all reference frames agree on which points are at zero relativistic interval from one another. And you might say, well, look, my past light cone corresponds to the set of points that's at zero interval from me. So actually this gives a good kind of notion of simultaneity, sort of updated, if you like, to the context of special relativity. Okay, so maybe counter object, a response to that, or counter argument to that might be, well, okay, so it's true that the stuff on my past light cone is at zero interval from me. Well, actually, it's not quite. Forget. I'm confusing two things. It's true that the stuff on my past light cone is zero interval from me, but you might say, well, so is the stuff on my future light cone. So are we going to count that as part of the present? Well, the initial cone view said no, it's just the past light cone stuff that counts as the present, and basically that was in order to preserve the relationship between what's present and what I can see. So the idea that something special about the stuff that I can see. I can't see the stuff on my future light cone, even though it's at zero interval from me. And also you might say, if we added the future light cone, then because some things on my past light cone are in the absolute past of some things on my future light cone, we'd get a kind of St. Augustine-like objection that would now be counting some parts of the present as in the past of other parts of the present. So that would be a reason not to go with the double cone view. Okay, so that rather undermines the idea that zero interval is just to be identified with simultaneity. But never mind that, there are probably worse objections for this cone view. So one objection is that, well, so far we've sort of accepted the idea that what's on your past light cone corresponds to the stuff that you can see. But actually that's not true, because the stuff on your past light cone is stuff that they're events or space-time points that could reach you via, or reach the space-time region that you're currently occupying via a light signal traveling through a vacuum. However, all the light that actually does reach you has not traveled through a vacuum, right? So everything you observe has been, you observe via light that's traveled through the Earth's atmosphere, which isn't a vacuum, which means that everything you observe is actually not on your past light cone, but rather in the interior of your past light cone. In other words, in your absolute past. And so now it looks like on the current view, all the stuff that you can observe is stuff that doesn't exist, right? Because the only stuff that does exist on the current view is stuff on your past light cone, whereas all the stuff that you can observe is in the interior of your past light cone. And so this rather looks like it undermines the motivation for presentism, the idea that there's something special, namely existence or presentness, about the stuff that you can observe. Okay. Another point, and maybe even more serious point, is that, well, I've sort of supposed that this current view is saying that what exists corresponds to my past light cone. But why mine, right? So any space-time point is associated with a different past light cone. And so I've sort of been assuming that I'm special, and that somehow what's the past light cone that corresponds to reality as my past light cone, rather than yours, or rather than some other object or some other space-time region or points. So that seems rather arrogant of me, and so you might think, well, actually, what we should be asking is, well, which point in space-time is such that its past light cone corresponds to what is real? And again, it sort of looks like you've got this worry about arbitrariness or ad hocness. So why would we choose any point rather than any other? And if we did try to make a principled choice, maybe the point corresponding to the center of mass of the universe, then again, it looks like it undermines a lot of the initial motivation for presentism, because you might say, well, look, the center of mass of the universe, none of us occupies that point. It's not even part of the region occupied by any of us, presumably. And so all of that stuff that we kind of subjectively or intersubjectively took to be special is actually not the special stuff, right? It's not the stuff that's present and therefore real. But then you might think, well, why do we want to endorse a picture of reality on which there is a special set of space-time points that's real, but it's completely different from the set of space-time points that any of us took to be special? You might think, well, why don't we just take the eternalist view that actually, it's all real? Okay. Right. Okay. Excellent. So then there's another view known as absolute Elsewhereism, and that's going to, it's a different view, but it's going to share many of the problems of the views that we've considered so far. So absolute Elsewhereism says, well, it's not the stuff on the past light cone that's present and real, but rather the stuff that's space-like separated from me, say, that's present and real. So the stuff in the absolute elsewhere, the stuff outside of the past and future light cones. Now, this view was taken by a philosopher called Hans Reichenbach, and so I suppose maybe there's some initial motivation, because you might think, well, the absolute elsewhere is the stuff that lies, in other words, the things that space-like separated from me are the stuff that lie outside of my absolute past and my absolute future. So, maybe this is a sort of notion of presence in special theory of relativity, so the stuff that's not determinately past and determinately future. But there are obviously, or fairly obviously, given the objections we've considered in response to the other theories or the other versions of presentism in the context of STR, there are fairly obvious difficulties with this. So, if we're to determine what counts as absolute elsewhere, we've got to pick a specific space-time point, because it depends, the light cone structure or the light cones associated with each space-time point are different and unique. So in each space-time point's likewise going to correspond to a different absolute elsewhere, or different regions of space-like separation, and so on the present view, different realities. So then we're back in the business of having to pick a special space-time point relative to which we're to determine what's real. Any choice might look sort of arbitrary or ad hoc, or if we could think of a choice that was motivated on physical grounds, like the center of mass of the universe, then again, what is present and what is real would very likely not correspond much at all to what any of us takes to be present or special or real. There are other problems with this view too, and so actually we have the St. Augustine objection again, because even if we've chosen a special point x, then some points that are space-like separated from x are going to be in the absolute future of other points that are space-like separated from x. So again, it would look like we have some parts of the present that are in the absolute past and absolute future of other parts of the present, and maybe that's a contradiction. Okay, so we've seen the problems that special relativity poses for presentism. Now, it should hopefully be fairly sort of intuitive that these sorts of problems are going to carry across to the growing universe theory. So again, the growing universe theory gives us a metaphysically special present. It's not special in virtue of existing while past and future don't exist, but rather it's metaphysically special in virtue of its being the growing edge of the universe. Now, the problem is that so not all frames of reference are going to agree about what's present. So yet it seems that we somehow need to decide what the growing edge of the universe is. It would kind of seem odd again to think that, well, what's real, what exists, where the edge of the growing edge of the universe is precisely, is relative to a frame of reference, right? Again, that would relativize reality to a frame of reference, which might be thought problematic. But then you've got to sort of privilege, do something like privilege a particular frame of reference. So you might, adopt something analogous to the surface model, and say, well, there just is a privileged frame of reference, even if special relativity doesn't give us that frame of reference, doesn't tell us which one it is. But and you might take that approach, but that again sort of undermines part of the original reason for thinking that the growing universe theory was plausible, namely that it sort of validates our everyday intuitions that there's something special about the present. Because of course, supposing we can settle on a privileged reference frame somehow, then it may well be that reference frame differs from my reference frame or your reference frame, and correspondingly, if it does, then there are some events that I regard as present that don't lie on the growing edge of the universe. They might lie in the future of it, so they might be things that don't actually exist yet on this model, or they might be things that lie in the past, and so although they exist, they're not on the growing edge of the universe. So again, the special relativity seems to pose some problems. Now, okay, there are alternatives to something like a surface model for the growing universe theorists to adopt. So they might adopt something that's a bit more in the vein of maybe the cone view or the absolute elsewhere view. I suppose sort of the corresponding, or maybe the most plausible growing universe theory in the vicinity would be one that identifies what exists with the absolute past, as well as maybe the past light cones. So this would sort of be like, it would be kind of like the cone view, in that it says that the past light cone is the present and exists, and the absolute past exists, which is the stuff inside of the past light cone. So again, that gives you a non-frame relative view on what exists. But then you quickly get into the same difficulties, or many of the same difficulties that the cone view got into, which is, for instance, that well, it's all very well saying the absolute past and the past light cone exist, but which absolute past and which past light cone are you talking about? So each space-time point X is associated with a different absolute past and backward light cone, past light cone. So you'd then again be in the business of choosing some privileged point in space-time with which to determine what exists. Again, you'd have this worry about arbitrariness, about ad hocness, and about the fact that whichever point you choose, it's unlikely to correspond, result in a view of what's real that corresponds to any of our naive kind of everyday views on what's real. Now, so I mean, we've sort of basically the theme has been that special relativity poses difficulties for any view that takes the present to be sort of metaphysically special. Obviously, presentism took the present to be metaphysically special in the sense that it was ontologically special. It was the only thing that existed. Growing universe theory took it to be metaphysically special in that it was the growing edge of the sort of dynamic growing edge of the universe. But more generally, A theories, even if they're combined with eternalism, are going to have difficulties. So the moving spotlight view would be the combination of an A theory with eternalism. Obviously doesn't say that only the present exists because, as an eternalist view, it also thinks that the past and the future exist. However, there is something special about the present on the moving spotlight theory. So it's supposed to be the present's supposed to be objective. It's supposed to be maybe corresponds to a special property that certain points in space-time have, and which points have this property changes, and this gives us a flow or passage of time. But the trouble again is that, well, what's present is frame relative, according to the special theory of relativity. And again, you might think, well, it would maybe be problematic to invest something that's frame relative with some metaphysically privileged status. You might sort of row back from that and, I suppose try to say that, maybe there's a special reference frame, so again, something akin to the surface model that STR doesn't give us, but which nevertheless exists. But again, you just run into these problems yet again of saying, well, which reference frame? Try and give a non-ad hoc answer to that. But if you do give a non-ad hoc answer, then the worry is that maybe the reference frame in question isn't going to correspond to any of our reference frames. Maybe it's going to be the reference frame of the center of mass of the universe. And so the sort of initial motivation for believing in the A theory that, our experience teaches us, if you like, that there's something special about the present, that gets undermined again. And so you might think, well, why not just be eternalist B theorists? So the sort of general moral has been, I suppose, that the intuitive notion of the present looks a little bit problematic in light of special relativity. So the B theoretic eternalist will tend to say, okay, look, I'm vindicated by special relativity. But many people still want to hold on to some form of A theory, presentism, growing universe theory, or moving spotlight theory. And so, as we've seen, they try to adapt the theories in various ways to accommodate special relativity. The ways in which we've surveyed, have been associated with maybe difficulties, but this is very much ongoing. People, I think, because they find sort of A theories very attractive, Maybe because they think of them as common sense, maybe because they take seriously the notion that time flows or time passes, and they think only the A theory can give us that. They sort of spend time working on trying to come up with a plausible reconciliation of the A theory with special relativity. Maybe so I guess of the views that we've canvassed, for what it's worth, maybe the surface model looks like the least objectionable. And you could apply some version of the surface model, not just in trying to save presentism, but alternatively trying to save growing universe theory or moving spotlight theory. But really, we're gonna want some compelling story about which reference frame's privileged, and again, hope that this reference frame corresponds at least roughly to the reference frame that we inhabit. Okay, so that's enough for this week. We'll be continuing to pursue the theme of time next week and the week after, where we're going to look at considerations concerning what gives time its direction, and also whether time travel's possible, either logically or metaphysically, or maybe even physically. Maybe we'll see that maybe general relativity gives us reasons for thinking that perhaps it is even physically possible. Okay, but that's next week's topic. And so I hope you have a good week. And so that's goodbye from me. Bye.